So there are some topics that are just difficult to talk about. Politics, taxes, infrastructure as code is another one of them. The trouble is it's boring. And so how do you make a boring topic not boring? I don't really know that you can. So in this video, what I'm going to do is, instead of telling you about infrastructure as code, I'm going to show you some actual things that you can do with infrastructure as code that actually are pretty cool and will benefit you and make your life easier. So I'm going to quit rambling and let's jump into it. So we're actually looking at an AWS CloudFormation template here. So if you haven't used CloudFormation before, it's a framework provided by AWS that allows you to define your infrastructure using code, which is why it's in a video called Infrastructure as Code. So we've got some mappings and parameters here, which we'll come back to. The part that I really want to focus on are these resources, and the resources are the things that are actually built by this template. So imagine that this template lives in the code repo of your application, right? It lives right alongside the code that runs your application. And every time you every time you create or merge a branch in your repo, this gets executed on AWS. So let's see what that does for us. The first thing that we see here is we're creating a DNS entry in there. And one thing that's worth pointing out here is we do this little conditional here that if the environment is production, which for this particular example, we defined production as the master branch. So whatever is in master is production, period. So if this is production, it gets deployed to our production domain, right? Otherwise, it gets deployed to our staging domain, which is pretty cool. So now for every branch of your repo, it gets its own DNS name. So if I had a branch that was called, Will's Bug Fix, I created that branch in our repo, it would create a URL, willsbugfix.staging.com. So now every branch that we create has its own URL that you can use for testing. We also create the load balancer, so it's a load balance service automatically. And if you look at this, we're checking to see if the environment is a development environment. And if it is, we place it on an internal subnet that that's not accessible from the internet. So what that means is whenever you open up a pull request, it creates this new environment, gives it a URL, but the only way to connect to that is if you have a VPN connection to the VPC inside of AWS. Now, what that does for you is it gives you the fully functioning environment, but sometimes in development, you can have bugs or other things that might expose code that you don't want the rest of the world to see. So this protects it and ensures that will never happen because, again, this is just defined in code. The CI/CD server is just going to build exactly what's defined here, and that definition says if this is a development environment, it doesn't get a publicly accessible name or route. So we also create some listeners here as well. So if this is the production branch, then it's going to create an SSL cert for it. It's going to set up HTTPS, and then it's going to automatically redirect any traffic over HTTP to HTTPS for you. So now you don't have to worry about someone accidentally accessing your site over HTTP. We're also creating the Docker image, or building the Docker image that this application runs as at the same time. And this is a parameterized template, so it allows you to pass in the amount of memory and CPU that your application needs. And during the build during the CI/CD process, we build that Docker image and put it in the Docker repository, and this gets passed the image to that URL or to that Docker image as well. One of the other cool things that this does is whenever you push to staging, it creates that Docker image. That Docker image gets tested by everyone, and then once it's approved for production, you release to production and it uses that exact same Docker image. So The Docker image that goes to production is the Docker image that was tested on staging, which is kind of a cool feature. If you're familiar with AWS, you know that you can put tags on everything, and tags give you a way to organize and group things. So this template will tag everything according to the tagging standards that you use at your company. For example, here, everything that we deploy gets tagged with a name parameter, a service, the environment, whether it's development, staging, or production, its role, and the team, which is essentially the team that owns this service. So if there's any problems with it, you know which team to contact. Now this sets it up so that you can organize things by these tags, and it's also really cool for billing purposes as well, so that at the end of the month you can take your AWS bill, break it up by tag, and then you can see which services are costing you money through aggregating these different services by the tags. The next thing that it does is it sets up a health check for every single Docker container and every single service. And it allows you to pass in parameters so you can specify what the health check interval should be, the path or URL that your Docker container should be expected to respond for a valid health check, and the timeout for that, and the healthy threshold count so you can determine when that container has failed. And this defines the auto-scaling parameters as well. So for example, we set here, if it's a development environment, we set the minimum number of containers to 1. Otherwise, we set it to a production service gets a minimum number of containers of 3 so that you always have fault tolerance and redundancy. And then you can specify a maximum number of containers here as well, that your service will never exceed that number of containers. And then we define the scale in and scale out policies, which determine the type of scaling that it does, the metric that it uses to determine the scaling, and then how much it's going to scale for each time, and then how long it waits to scale out and how long it waits to scale back in. Finally, there's some alarms defined in here as well, because if you've ever built and deployed a production service, you may have either forgotten to set up alerting and monitoring on it, period, or if you did, it was a separate service, so you had to go and custom build that alerting and monitoring system or integrate it manually. Well, right here it's built into the code, so it's going to happen every time for every service that uses this template, so that you can confidently deploy to production, and you know that if any of the alarms are exceeded, an alert's going to go off and somebody's going to get rolled out of bed. If you've ever wondered about who should get rolled out of bed when an alert goes off, I've got a video that I'll link here and down below in the description. It's actually a pretty funny video, check it out. And if you've ever wondered about what you should do when you do get paged and you're on call, I've got another video that I'll link here that tells you exactly how to handle production outages, and it's just based on a lot of the tips and tricks that I've put together from, I don't know, like 30 years of being on call. So it's got a lot of good content in there. Be sure and check that out. And there you have it. Infrastructure as code in 10 minutes or less. So obviously it's not going to make you an expert in infrastructure as code. It may not even apply to your exact environment, but hopefully what it did is give you some ideas of the different things that are possible using infrastructure as code, or defining your infrastructure as code. Maybe it sparked some ideas for you about how you can implement that in your own environment, and then you can take a look at your own technology stack, see what specific tools or resources are available to implement it there, and then that will send you on your path to defining your infra as code, making your life a lot better. If you liked the video, hit the like button, leave me any comments, and if you've got any cool stuff that you've done with infra as code, I'd love to hear that. And be sure and hit the subscribe button down below and click the notification bell so that you get notified whenever I release the next new video. All right, we'll see you next time.